All right, I'm going to get started. It's 1 o'clock. We've got people, it's 1 o'clock Eastern time. We've got people logging in. The numbers are going up. That's so exciting. And so I want to keep us on track because we've got a lot of information to share with you today. My name is Lindsey Roberson. I'm the Director of Legal Engagement for the Human Trafficking Institute, and I could not be more pleased to be with you all today. I was looking at the invite list or the registration list a little bit before we got started today and saw just some old friends, old colleagues, all the way back from when I was a state prosecutor in North Carolina. So it's a small world that we work in this anti-trafficking space, and we make a lot of friends and colleagues along the way. And it's so wonderful when things come full circle and you get to see people. So I just want to say thank you all, every single person who registered for our webinar today to learn more about our annual human trafficking report on this very important year, the 2020 report. And I'll share with you in just a minute why I think it is such an important year. And we're really excited to be sharing that with you. So I want to give you just a brief overview of what our hour together is going to look like. I'm going to be joined today by the authors of the Federal Human Trafficking Report, our Associate Legal Counsel at the Human Trafficking Institute, Alyssa Currier and Kyleigh Feehs, who I am so fortunate to work with and have been able to work with over the last couple of years as we have put the report together, which truly, truly is a labor of love. I'm going to talk to you about what goes into the report, but some of you who are listening today already know, because we have some folks in the audience today who have been prior Douglas Fellows of our fellowship program, who have poured their own labor into this project. We also have prior staff members who have been everything from report readers and proofreaders to giving us their own personal experiences in the professional field. We also have practitioners who are joining us, and one of the ways that we shape the report, that we decide what to put into the report, is by speaking to practitioners about, what is interesting to them, what is helpful to them, what is compelling, what helps them move their work forward, what helps them identify the gaps. And so we're really excited to have several of you with us today. That is such an important part of the work that we do, and we couldn't do it without all of you. So, and we also have staff from our development team today, our communications team, who's helping make this possible. We're so grateful to you. And we are so grateful to those of you in the audience that help us do this work by donating your resources. We couldn't do it without you. This is a huge project, a huge undertaking. And so we're so grateful to everyone who's here today, no matter what role you have played in this report. And even if you're just here to learn more about human trafficking today, that's amazing. You are contributing to your sphere of influence. You will go back into your workplace, into your community, and you'll know a little bit more just from this hour that you spend with us today about what's happening in the United States with regard to our enforcement efforts to combat human trafficking. So again, thanks to everyone who's here. I want to tell you, for those of you who are not familiar with the report, and maybe some of you who are, what is the Federal Human Trafficking Report? What is it? What's in it? What's not in it? How do we put it together? Where does the information come from? And so I'm going to give you a little overview of that, and then I'm going to turn it over to Associate Legal Counsel and authors of the report to tell you some key findings from this year's report, from the 2020 report. Then we'll be opening it up to Q&A for you all in the audience. So be thinking about questions you might have for us as we're talking. You can plug those into the chat feature, the Q&A feature. So feel free to do that anytime, and we'll have those questions moderated at the end by our staff. So we're really excited to take those questions from you. So about the report, the Federal Human Trafficking Report, this is our 4th year in publication. And when I was a prosecutor in the federal government at the Department of Justice, I had the privilege of reading the report as a practitioner. We're really busy practitioners. We have busy dockets. We have lots of cases that we're prosecuting, and we don't necessarily have time to read, compile data from federal human trafficking cases all over the US. Not only do we not have the time to do that because we're focused on our cases that we're prosecuting, but there really wasn't any report like this that was chronicling all the prosecution efforts in the United States within the federal government system and giving a data objective analysis of that, of those cases. And so when I was prosecuting, I would, read the report and it was such a fantastic resource for me in a way that it really summarized succinctly where we are with regard to kinds of cases we're prosecuting, the types of victims that are being identified in those cases, the types of coercion that is being used, the types of charges that are being brought, jurisdictions that are charging lots of human trafficking cases, jurisdictions that maybe haven't charged one yet. And so it's a really useful tool for me as a prosecutor and practitioner. So it also kind of came into a gap that existed where there was no cumulative composite of this information that existed. And so the process of putting the human trafficking report together takes a ton of effort, and never more so than it did at the beginning. Because what we were doing, what our staff was doing, was painstakingly pulling every single public piece of information about these cases. And what I mean by that is the report is limited to publicly available data. So there are federal there are websites that allow us to see every single case or part of a case that is filed, both for criminal and civil human trafficking cases. But in order to make that data available in the report, we have to have lawyers pulling every single piece of that case, from the complaint, from the trial transcripts, and looking through every single press release that comes out about that case, the appeals that come as a result of that case, so we can look at every component of the human trafficking case. And that's just one case. And as you'll see, we have thousands of cases in our database now. So when I say this is a labor-intensive project, truly, truly it is, but never more so than when in the beginning we had to start building this database that previously did not exist, to put all of this information in one place, all that case information in, so that when we could start breaking it down by data points. And so over time, we've started to add more and more data points. And so I'll share a little bit about that, and Kyleigh and Alyssa will talk about that as well. But I want to tell you, so we pull all that public information that's available about federal human trafficking cases, criminal and civil. And then we go through for a number of data points, which we'll talk about. But I want to tell you also what is not in our report, what we don't cover, what we can't cover. And a lot of reports around the US and around the world, one of the biggest cases or questions is, how big is the problem of human trafficking? How many people, how many cases, how many victims, how many offenders? Where does it happen? And this is not a prevalence study. Prevalence studies are a very different type of project, and they are also incredibly labor intensive, but this is not a prevalence study. You know, when we think about human trafficking, we think about the 3 Ps of protection and prevention and prosecution. And so as a prior prosecutor who's worked in this area of vulnerable victims, I can tell you firsthand, we're never going to prosecute our way out of human trafficking. We recognize that. We absolutely want to encourage victim-centered types of investigations and prosecutions. That's what we believe is the best practice, absolutely. What I've seen work the best for not only great outcomes of cases, but most importantly, for the survivors who are at the center of those cases. So we recognize we're not going to prosecute our way out of human trafficking, but this document really does focus on the investigation and prosecution component, the enforcement component of federal trafficking in the United States, giving us a snapshot of what is happening in regard to how we are enforcing our federal statutes for human trafficking. So it's not a prevalence study. When you see the numbers, when you hear Kyleigh and Alyssa talk about statistics, know that every single one of those statistics, every single one of those numbers comes from the common repository of that publicly available data that is based on prosecutions, right? So just keep that in mind when you're hearing this information, and when you're hopefully reading the report, which is going to be published next week, and we're so excited. So this really is sort of a sneak peek into the report. The report also doesn't cover state prosecutions. So I used to be a state prosecutor in the state of North Carolina, and of course we prosecuted our own human trafficking cases, but those cases don't go into the same common repository as the federal cases. So at the Human Trafficking Institute, we don't have the ability to pull all 50 state cases, state prosecutions, into our report. So this is federal prosecutions from the 94 districts across the United States. Our report also can't cover cases that aren't reported, cases that aren't prosecuted. So if it doesn't, there are oftentimes cases that become investigated, but they don't necessarily come all the way to a prosecution or to a charge. And so if that's not the case, if it doesn't get to that level in the investigation, to that stage, then we won't have access to that information to include in the report. So that's a limitation as well. So once we started putting all this case data into the report, we started to have the opportunity to start thinking critically about, well, what data is important to practitioners and to the public? What actually will help us identify how we're doing and how we could do better, right? And so over the years, over the 4 years of the report, every year we add new data distinctive points. So as I mentioned earlier, we started looking at the types of coercion that traffickers use and that prosecutors use as their theory of proving their case for trafficking. So is it nonviolent coercion? Is it violent coercion? How does that break down between forced labor cases and sex trafficking cases? How does that break down when you have victims who are minors and victims who are adults? And so we're able to parse that data out over the years. We've also added data points about prior vulnerabilities of victims. What are some of the most common vulnerabilities that we see victims coming into the cases, into exploitation, already carrying? And we're able to comment and provide data on that. How are victims recruited? Are they recruited online? Are they recruited on the street? Are they recruited by a family member? We're able to include data there. So all different types of data that over the years, we've been able to become more detailed and more focused, but also more expansive. So that's a really exciting component for us, but it also is a challenge in terms of deciding what are we going to actually include in the report each year, because as you might imagine, our 60, 70 page report is really robust, but it is not the whole universe of knowledge that we have in universe of data. So if you're a practitioner in the field and you're listening to this and you start thinking, well, I would love to know if you have data on this point or that point, we're here for you. So that's an opportunity. If you're a practitioner, please feel free to reach out to us, and we provide targeted briefings on specific data points. We can look at specific regions and let you know what's happening in that region with regard to a certain type of trafficking or a certain type of prosecution or a certain type of exploitation or venue that's being used. So this year, it's 20 years of federal human trafficking data. We have finally compiled all of the cases since the enactment of the Trafficking Victim and Protection Act, which was originally enacted in the year 2000. So we have 20 years of data. Really, really exciting. And we'll be talking a little bit about those trends today. But when you see the report, when you download the report, when you get a copy of it, you're going to see lots of trend analyses about the 20 years. What has this looked like over 20 years of enforcement in the US, which frankly speaking is still a relatively short period of time to be prosecuting a type of crime. And so this year we thought it was really interesting. One of the things I think is really interesting about the report that, again, I would have loved to have had as a prosecutor is a timeline of every few years, the Trafficking Victim Protection Act, that federal law, which outlaws forced labor and sex trafficking and is amended every few years. It's reauthorized every few years. And the types of charges have grown, the types of victim remedies have grown, having restitution that's mandated that must be ordered for victims. There's all types of victim protection and criminal enforcement that has changed over time and expanded over time thanks to the reauthorizations of the Trafficking Victim and Protection Act. And so we've included a timeline of those reauthorizations in this year's report. So really excited about that. But just taking a quick glance at a couple of the trends, and Kyleigh and Alyssa are going to dig into this a little bit more, looking at the numbers sort of at a glance over the years. Looking at the total number of cases that we have in our database. Alyssa, if you'll go to the next slide. Thank you. So as I mentioned, we have thousands of prosecutions in our database, over 2,000 cases that we're pulling all of this data from. And then we've got over 4,000 defendants, and we've got information about those defendants. What is the outcome of their case? What's the length of resolution it takes to go from the beginning stages of that case all the way through appeal? What was the sentence? What are the common average sentences for these cases? How do those break down? What other types of penalties do defendants face in these cases? And then within these identified cases, we have over 4,800 victims who've been identified. And that's where we pull the victim data, victim information about those prior vulnerabilities, types of coercion that are used, the ages of the victims, the demographics, the gender, where did they originate, or did they come from outside of the US? Were they trafficked into the US? Were they trafficked once they got to the US? We have information about all of that, and Kyleigh and Alyssa are going to touch on that. And so if you look at the next slide is just a real quick overview snapshot of 20 years of prosecutions. The blue is sex trafficking. So you can see that we've prosecuted historically far, far more sex trafficking cases than we have forced labor, which is the orange. And so, we get a lot of questions about this, and we're happy to talk to you about it. Our goal really is with the report to provide this objective data for practitioners to use for their own purposes, to look at their own work that they're doing. In the last couple of years, we saw, as you'll see here, a bit of a decline in trafficking cases, in sex trafficking cases in particular. And then this year, we've actually seen that number go back up again, which has been the historic trend over the last 20 years, right? Is a steady incline in those cases. One of the things that Kyleigh and Alyssa will mention to you too is that a lot of folks are asking about, the impact of the pandemic, of COVID, on our ability to identify cases, investigate, and prosecute. Really probably is a little too soon to tell, but what we do know, of course, is that many courts were closed down and trying to grapple with, how to conduct hearings safely, how to, move defendants through court safely. And so that's going to have an impact on the way the criminal justice system works, but also it's going to have an impact probably on our ability to identify already vulnerable victims who are made more vulnerable anytime there's a natural disaster. So there's a real life impact there as well. So with that said, I'm going to turn this over to Kyleigh and Alyssa to share with you about key findings from 2020 with a moderated discussion, and then we'll switch to Q&A. Thank you again so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Lindsey, for that great introduction. I'm Shannon Gage. I am the social media and digital marketing coordinator, and I'm just going to lead us right now into a time of question and answer. So if anybody has any questions from the audience, just go ahead and drop those into the Q&A box in the bottom right of your screen, and we will address those shortly. But first, I just want to kick it off by talking about some of the key findings from the 2020 report. So Kyleigh and Alyssa, can you share some of the key findings from 2020 data that you found while making this report?
Sure. First of all, thanks everyone again for being here. I want to say a special thanks to the Douglas Fellows who are on the call, who contributed to this report, who I got to work with this year. One of the key findings that we find every year with our analysis of this data is victim demographics. So in 2020, 53% of all victims were children. The percentage is always higher in sex trafficking cases, and this year it was 55% of victims in sex trafficking cases that were children, compared to 23% of victims in forced labor cases. This year, we thought it might be helpful to look at more specific age groups. Most child victims in sex trafficking cases were between the ages of 14 and 17 when they were first recruited or exploited. Convicted traffickers who exploit children in this age group face a mandatory minimum prison sentence of 10 years. 12% of child victims in sex trafficking cases were below the age of 14 years old. Convicted traffickers who exploit children in this age group face a mandatory minimum of 15 years imprisonment. And while there's no difference in the prison sentence based on age of an adult victim, I think it is notable that 92% of adult victims in sex trafficking cases are below the age of 30. So we are talking about a really young population here. And now this graphic is depicting only those victims identified in human trafficking prosecutions that were filed in 2020. So it's not including any pending cases, but the breakdown is similar across all cases. You can see that most victims are girls, females below the age of 18 years old, followed by women 18 years or older. There are far fewer men and boys identified as victims each year. This is not because trafficking doesn't affect males, but because of challenges in identifying males. And some of that is due to stigmas that keep male victims, make it less likely that they're going to report. Traffickers, one thing we know is that traffickers often include or recruit and exploit individuals who have one or more vulnerabilities that they can take advantage of. And in sex trafficking cases in 2020, the most common vulnerability among victims in sex trafficking cases was having a substance dependency. Other common vulnerabilities were having run away from home, having undocumented or irregular immigration status, being in the foster care system, homelessness, and having been trafficked in the past. Some of the same vulnerabilities were common among forced labor cases, but undocumented immigration status was by far the most common. This corresponds with the fact that there's a higher percentage of foreign national victims in forced labor cases compared to sex trafficking cases. Other top vulnerabilities were intellectual disabilities, language barriers, homelessness, and having run away from home.
Thank you, Alyssa. I'm going to shift gears a little bit away from victim demographics and talk about some of the key findings related to convictions and sentences for traffickers. So as Lindsey mentioned, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is built upon what is commonly called the 3P framework. So the prevention of trafficking, the protection of victims, and the prosecution of traffickers. And really, commitment to all three of these Ps is critical to an effective response to trafficking. But as an organization, HTI focuses primarily on that third P, the prosecution of traffickers. As Lindsey mentioned, this does not mean that we believe it's possible to prosecute our way out of trafficking or that prosecution is the only way to stop traffickers. But holding traffickers accountable through prosecution is an essential component of a holistic approach to combating trafficking, and one of the reasons that we published this report. So since the TVPA's enactment, federal courts have convicted a total of 3,169 defendants in human trafficking cases. So these are defendants that are convicted of human trafficking, so sex trafficking and forced labor, as well as other criminal conduct in the case. You'll notice that this graphic looks fairly similar to the graphic that Lindsey showed in terms of new cases. Over the past 2 decades, we've seen an increase in the number of defendants convicted for conduct related to sex trafficking. When you look at forced labor convictions, you'll see they've remained largely unchanged over the past 2 decades. I also want to flag this drop in 2020 represents a 51% decline from 2019 to 2020 in the number of defendants convicted. So as Lindsey mentioned, we've been asked frequently in our preliminary briefings and in conversations with stakeholders over the past few months about what the pandemic's impact is going to be on human trafficking within the United States. And because we look at prosecution data, it's likely too soon to know the implications of how trafficker schemes have shifted, the types of vulnerabilities that are being targeted. But we can see from our data the effect that the pandemic has had on the criminal justice system. So it's not surprising that with court closures and with delays in criminal proceedings, that we've had this corresponding drop in convictions, and that's consistent with what we've seen and heard on the ground and talking with prosecutors working on these cases. So I don't anticipate that this is a trend that will continue into 2021, but I felt it was important to highlight in light of the 51% decline. The last key finding from 2020 that I want to highlight is about victim restitution. So victim restitution is money that a court orders a defendant to pay to compensate victims for damages or financial losses that are incurred as a result of their exploitation. And in trafficking cases, restitution is incredibly important, as victims have often worked without pay for the financial benefit of their trafficker. So as a result, they leave trafficking situations with few or no resources with which to rebuild their life. So restitution order is really essential for recovery. In recognition of this, as Lindsey mentioned, the TVPA mandates that courts order defendants convicted of human trafficking crimes to pay victim restitution. However, as this graphic, Alyssa, if you could go to the next slide, indicates, courts have historically really failed to order victim restitution against the majority of convicted defendants, even though it's required by law. So there's a lot going on in this graphic. Let me direct your eyes to kind of this gray shaded box, which looks at the percentage of convicted defendants ordered to pay restitution for both sex trafficking and forced labor. You can see that in 2017, as well as in 2016, courts ordered only 25% of convicted defendants to pay mandatory restitution. However, in 2020, this percentage increased to 50%. So in just 3 years, actually, since we've been publishing this report, we've seen the percentage of defendants ordered to pay mandatory restitution double. So our hope is that with continued education for courts and for prosecutors on both the importance of restitution, as well as tools for calculating victims' losses, we'll continue to see this percentage to rise in years to come.
Thank you both. That's really helpful to hear about those findings from 2020. That makes me think, Lindsey mentioned earlier that each year that we publish this report, we expand the scope of data that we collect on federal human trafficking court cases. So could you just share some of the new and unique data points that were collected and reported on in 2020?
Sure. So in past years, we've reported on the social media platforms that traffickers use to advertise their victims and solicit purchasers of commercial sex. But there's growing interest and awareness of the role the internet plays in recruiting individuals into exploitative situations. So this year, we began tracking the social media platforms where victims are recruited. In total, 41% of victims in sex trafficking cases were recruited online. And among adult victims recruited online, most were recruited on WeChat, Facebook, and/or Instagram. And among children recruited online, the most common platforms were Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat. Now, if these platforms surprise you because they don't all seem like the most popular social media apps anymore, it's important to remember that we get this data from court documents underlying prosecutions of criminal conduct that often occurred several years ago. So we do anticipate seeing a shift in these platforms over time. Another recruitment data point we added this year was the type of relationship that someone exploited in order to traffic a victim. In the past, we looked exclusively at the defendant's relationship to the victim, and the defendant is the person being prosecuted. But victims are often recruited by someone other than the person being prosecuted. Here you can see that of victims who were recruited to sex trafficking schemes by someone they knew, 24% were recruited by an intimate partner or spouse, 23% through a mutual friend of their trafficker, 14% by a friend or classmate, and 14% by a drug dealer. Victims were also recruited by parents, guardians, religious leaders, extended family, including partners of parents and guardians, and landlords, among others. In forced labor cases, we see many of the same relationships exploited for recruitment, with the addition of employers and smugglers being top categories. This year, we also added a lot of information about foreign national victims. 13% of victims were foreign nationals. Now, this doesn't mean that 87% of victims were necessarily US citizens. Since many cases don't have that information available, we can't know the nationality of the victims. But we do know that at least 13% of victims were foreign nationals. And as I mentioned before, there's a much higher percentage of foreign national victims in forced labor cases than in sex trafficking cases. To the right, you can see the geographical regions where foreign national victims came from. 67% of foreign national victims in federal human trafficking prosecutions came from the Western Hemisphere, most from Mexico and Guatemala. East Asia and the Pacific accounts for the next highest percentage of foreign national victims, with a large number originating from China. Now, when we're talking about foreign national victims, we're not necessarily talking about being trafficked across the border into the United States. Although the facts underlying these prosecutions do indicate that a high percentage of foreign national victims were trafficked into the United States, 9% of foreign national victims came to the US of their own accord, whether documented or undocumented, and then were trafficked after entering the country. And this could be immediately after entering or years after entering the United States. Additionally, at least 8% of foreign national victims were trafficked exclusively abroad.
So one of my favorite times when we're writing the report each year is as soon as the report is published, and actually even sometimes before that, we're constantly making lists of what are the new data points that we should be capturing. In fact, this is one of the reasons that we host preliminary findings each year, is to think through, are there ways that we can expand the data that we collect? And so one of the areas that's come up quite frequently is how do we increase our data on investigations? And so for the first year in the 2020 report, we looked at how cases were reported to law enforcement. We have limited information on investigations in our report. It's important to point out that we're only looking at human trafficking investigations that result in federal prosecution. So our data is an underrepresentation of the total number of human trafficking investigations taking place across the United States, as many cases aren't prosecuted or are prosecuted at the state level. But historically, we've looked at some investigative data points on which agencies are involved in these investigations, but we've been asked to talk a little bit and to capture data on kind of how or why these cases are initiated. And so we started to track data on both reactive and proactive investigations. And by reactive, I mean cases that are reported to law enforcement and that report triggers an investigation into the conduct in the case. So at least 28% of our active criminal cases in 2020 were investigated following a case report to law enforcement. There were various ways that cases were reported to law enforcement, but the most common method involved a victim contacting law enforcement for assistance, either directly or with the support of a nonprofit or a victim or trafficking hotline, which took place in 37% of cases. The next most common method was through a family member. So this could be a parent, a grandparent, or sibling. And oftentimes these were cases where the family member contacted law enforcement about a child who had run away from home or who was missing. And that report is what then led to the investigation into a trafficking case. So the report includes a complete list of these case referrals. I was talking through these talking points with my husband last night, and he asked, why is there such a high percentage of other in this graphic? And so I thought it important to point out that due to the variety of ways that these cases are reported, we've categorized 18% as other, and these are types of referrals that account for less than 1% of the referrals. And so this includes babysitters and nail salon patrons to teachers and to hotel occupants. The next new data point that I want to briefly mention, and Lindsey talked about as well, is the inclusion of a timeline on key developments in the TVPA. So this isn't a new data point per se, but a new feature that we've included to show how federal anti-trafficking laws have evolved over the past 2 decades. So the timeline identifies some of the key kind of prosecution-related amendments in each of the reauthorizations, and then also adds data to illustrate kind of the impact of those amendments. So for example, in 2003, the reauthorization of the TVPA created a civil cause of action for trafficking victims to sue their traffickers in federal court. So the timeline includes data on how efforts to hold traffickers civilly liable have increased, particularly over the past 5 years. So this is a feature that I don't anticipate will continue to include in subsequent reports, but we hope that it's helpful in this special kind of 20th edition version of the report. And for those who are interested, the report has a pretty comprehensive methodology in the back, which will give a list of all of the new data points that we've added for this year.
Thanks, Kyleigh. And earlier, Lindsey mentioned that each year, HTI uses the report data to brief government agencies on trends in federal human trafficking prosecutions. So with this data in mind, can you tell us kind of how the report can help government agencies shape their response to human trafficking?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to answer this in terms of how we hope that the data will be used to shape the government's response to trafficking. As the 20-year graphics show, the US government has made significant strides over the past 2 decades in efforts to prosecute traffickers, particularly in regards to sex trafficking. But in addition to showing the progress that's been made, the data also reveals the gaps that still exist. Where do we need to invest efforts in the next 2 decades? So one section of the report focuses on kind of location data, where cases are being prosecuted and where they're not. You can see from this heat map which states handled the highest number of defendants in federal human trafficking cases, as well as states that handle the least. So I have a few disclaimers about this map and about our location data. First, this map is looking only at federal cases within these states. And as with all of the data within our report, this is not an indication of prevalence. So I don't want you to look at this map and think that just because Illinois has a higher number of defendants in federal human trafficking cases than Indiana, there's more trafficking that's taking place on the ground in Illinois than Indiana. And then lastly, each of the states that have higher populations have a higher number of federal districts. So California and Texas and New York each have 4 federal districts. And this obviously increases their ability to, and their capacity to investigate and prosecute trafficking cases. So we show you this map so you can see which districts are prioritizing and actively prosecuting human trafficking. So I'm sorry for all the disclaimers. It's hard for me to talk about our data without making all of these necessary disclaimers. I'm sure our communications team has been frustrated with me over the past few weeks because I'm constantly asking, are we giving enough context? Are we telling the limitations? But I think it's really important that we are clear about what our data shows and what it doesn't show. So back to the question that you asked in terms of the gaps, by breaking this data down by district, we're able to inform the government of high performing districts as well as districts with very few or no human trafficking cases. In fact, this is probably the data point that's most frequently requested by our government stakeholders. Are there districts that haven't prosecuted a human trafficking case this year or in the past 5 years? Are there districts that have yet to prosecute a forced labor case or an adult sex trafficking case? And so this district data helps us inform the US government where additional resources geographically need to be invested. Another gap that Lindsey mentioned is how few forced labor cases have been prosecuted over the past 2 decades. The striking statistic from the data is that more sex trafficking prosecutions were filed in 2020 alone than forced labor prosecutions filed altogether since the TVPA's enactment. But in addition to identifying this gap, we believe that the data also serves as a useful tool for the US government in building an effective response. So for example, the report shows all of the different industries in which traffickers have exploited victims for labor or services over the past 2 decades. So that's indicated by this pie chart on the left. And you can see the variety of industries, from domestic work to agricultural work to work in construction and in beauty services. And as the US government strengthens proactive forced labor investigations and efforts to identify victims of forced labor, this data is an indication of where known instances of forced labor are occurring across the United States. In addition, the data identifies which districts and even which federal prosecutors have achieved successful convictions in more complex and less commonly prosecuted human trafficking cases. So these are forced labor cases, as well as sex trafficking cases involving adults, which require the government to prove force, fraud, or coercion, which can be really challenging at times. So by identifying these top districts and these top prosecutors, we're able to really compile best practices and foster collaboration across federal districts. So let me give you one example. Earlier this year, we had an attorney that reached out to us about a forced labor case in a nail salon. And they were asking if we could identify other districts that have handled this type of case, other forced labor cases in nail salons. And so we were able to use our data to pull together a list of these cases in the districts and the prosecutors who've worked on these cases, and to share the charging instruments and the court documents with this district that was handling this type of case for the first time. So these are just a few examples of how we hope that the data is useful for the federal government in strengthening their response to trafficking. Each year, we host briefings and roundtable discussions with our government stakeholders with the goal of really making sure that the data that we collect and that we report on is the most useful.
Thanks, that's a great answer. And it's really helpful to hear how the report and knowing this data and these trends are helpful in shaping government and NGO responses to trafficking. But I'm curious, for individuals who may not be working in the anti-trafficking space, who may not be attorneys, who may not be practitioners, how can they use this data and interpret it?
So I think there are lots of misconceptions about human trafficking, particularly floating around online. And our data can help anyone counter misleading narratives with the facts. For example, if you Google human trafficking, you'll get a lot of images of locked cells, cages, chains, blindfolds, even though this isn't what human trafficking usually looks like. In fact, 57% of the coercive tactics that traffickers used in sex trafficking cases were not physical. And what does this mean exactly? Well, when you look at the most common methods of coercion there on the right, you can see that the top category is withholding pay, which does not involve physical violence or restraint, but is nonetheless a powerful tool for control and manipulation. Similarly, 44% of cases involved threats of physical violence, another powerful tactic that doesn't require anything physical. This isn't to say that traffickers don't use physical forms of coercion. 43% of coercive tactics in sex trafficking cases were physical, including physical abuse, exploiting a substance dependency, and rape or sexual violence, among others. But it's important to remember that coercion often doesn't leave visible marks and isn't as obvious as cages or blindfolds, which is why it is so difficult to identify victims and prosecute traffickers. The same is true in forced labor cases. And this year, there was an even higher percentage of non-physical coercion in forced labor cases compared to sex trafficking cases. Another misconception about human trafficking is that it necessarily involves the movement of people from one place to another. And the truth is, it sometimes does, but not always. In fact, fewer than half of sex trafficking cases involved criminal conduct in more than one state, meaning most trafficking prosecuted at the federal level were schemes contained to a single state, and even fewer cases involved criminal activity abroad. So trafficking doesn't require crossing state borders, and it also doesn't require crossing international borders. And finally, there's sometimes a sensationalized concept that sex trafficking is perpetrated by large-scale organized sex trafficking rings. And while this is true sometimes, it's not the norm, at least not in cases prosecuted at the federal level. In fact, only 5% of sex trafficking cases involved sex trafficking directed by an organized criminal syndicate or gang. In contrast, 59% of traffickers operated independently, sometimes through what's called a pimp relationship with their victim, or through familial trafficking, where a family member, like a spouse or a parent, exploits someone within their own family for commercial sex.
So our goal, as Alyssa mentioned, of the report, among others, is really that this is an educational tool for individuals to educate themselves as well as their communities and their audiences around them. We recognize that the report includes a significant amount of data on a really heavy topic. We've intentionally designed the report in a way that we hope is visually appealing and easy to digest. Shannon is a member of our communications team, and she's been working diligently over the past weeks and months to create some phenomenal social media graphics that convey the report's data. So in addition to reading the report, I would encourage you to share these graphics on social media so we can continue to increase data-driven awareness about human trafficking and efforts to stop trafficking within the United States. Before handing things back over to Shannon for Q&A, I know there's a number of questions coming in, but feel free to continue to send your questions through the chat. But I also wanted to share the number for the human trafficking hotline here, 1-888-373-7888. And this hotline is run by an amazing nonprofit, Polaris. One thing that the data point on case referrals just emphasize is that you may encounter victims of trafficking in so many settings in your day-to-day life, whether that's getting your nails done, or if you're a medical provider working in the emergency room, or you're at a hotel while you're traveling. And so it's really important that you educate yourself on the signs of trafficking. Polaris has some wonderful resources on what those indicators are, and know this number and resources to contact if you see a suspected incident of trafficking.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kyleigh. And thanks for all your great answers. I'm going to invite Lindsey back on screen, and we're going to address some of the questions that we've gotten from the audience. So thank you so much for all of your questions. We have a lot of questions, and I'm not sure we're going to have time to get through all of them today. So if we don't get to your question, we'll send the Federal Human Trafficking Report out to your inbox on June 8th when it's released, and you can look in there for more information. But for now, I'm just going to ask you guys, we got a question that came in. Do you have any plans to incorporate state cases into this report in the future?
I can take that. Yeah, we would love to. However, it's a really heavy lift. And one of the reasons that we're able to collect federal human trafficking case data is that there's really one database that collects all of the pleadings in court documents for these cases. To write state reports to this extent would require access to all of those documents to state proceedings. And also would be difficult to account for the variations in state law and how trafficking is defined in each of these jurisdictions. So we've talked about it organizationally. Could we pilot it in a state or two? We'd love to down the road, but it's not anywhere in kind of the near future.
Yeah, and there was another question too, kind of as a follow-up to that, about how would one go about it? And I think, part of the answer is it depends on what your state sort of criminal system looks like online, right? And I know some states have more robust information with regard to types of charges that look more like PACER, the sort of federal online docket entry, than other states do, right? And so your ability to cull that data, pull it together, would really sort of depend on, is there already a common repository that you could kind of go and start pulling that information from? That would be step one, because without that, you'd be going district by district, asking folks for their case information, which we do in our partner countries. We go district by district and ask our partner prosecutors for that data, but it's that's a painstaking process as well.
Thank you. My next question that I have is, do you have information on how many victims were recruited by strangers?
So we do. So what the data that we have is shows a positive whether there was a relationship. The data that we have also shows if we don't know what the relationship is. So it's hard to say. A lot of times, if it was a stranger, we might not know definitively that it was a stranger, if that makes sense. It's easier to tell when there is a relationship than when there's not one. So in the report, you can get the percentage of individuals who we know had a relationship with the person who recruited them, and then the percentage of unknown. We could start, we do track when they are recruited by a stranger where that information is known. It's just not commonly something that's terribly easy to find.
Yeah, we track when traffickers have kidnapped their victims as well, or they're charged with kidnapping, and there are just a handful of cases among the thousands that we track. So that's one of the things that Alyssa didn't mention in the myths, but the news stories that I see floating around, and I've even had friends ask me, is how likely is it that a trafficker is going to abduct me from a Walmart parking lot? And our data does not show that that's a common fact pattern that traffickers are using here in the United States. Instead, they're targeting people that they knew or people that have existing vulnerabilities that they're able to then exploit to compel labor or sex.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, guys. I do have another question. It's, are trafficking cases ever charged with other crimes other than trafficking? Like, are there other charges thrown in there that complicate the case or anything like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So our report, like the main data in the report, is looking at cases where at least one defendant was charged with a crime under Chapter 77. So these are crimes under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, as well as historical slavery statutes that existed prior to the TVPA's enactment. But we do also, in a feature box, track cases that have been identified as human trafficking cases, but are charged outside of the TVPA. So we do a proactive search of court documents to see whether there's substantial evidence that there was force, fraud, or coercion in adult sex trafficking cases or commercial sex with minors and in child sex trafficking cases. And then we track that data separately within the report. So there are a number of reasons that a prosecutor may not charge a trafficker under the TVPA. This could be evidentiary challenges or a defendant who agrees to cooperate, and so the government charges them with a lesser offense outside of the statute. Historically, I think in the first 2 years of the report, we captured these cases all together. And then last year we made the change to pull these cases outside of, to capture them separately, really to give a more nuanced approach. Can we see the impact when cases are charged outside of the TVPA? What do conviction rates look like? What do sentences look like? How often are those defendants ordered to pay victim restitution? And so you can find that feature within the report. I don't have the page number off the top of my head, but there is a whole section. This year we had 92 additional cases that we tracked that were charged outside of the TVPA.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you, Kyleigh. I did have another question that came in. Back when we were talking about victim demographics, it's just a clarifying question. What did you mean by buyer case in that instance?
Yeah, great question. So there is a subset of defendants, and remember, defendants are those who are being prosecuted by the government for trafficking. There's a subset of sex trafficking defendants that we call in the report buyer defendants. And those are individuals who the government is charging with sex trafficking because they purchased or attempted to purchase sex from a trafficking victim. And so cases that involve buyer defendants, we call buyer cases. And in these cases, historically, there has been, and in 2020, there's been a higher percentage of child victims and a higher percentage of male victims as well.
Thanks, Alyssa. That's really helpful. I have a question about restitution. So why do you guys think that there may be less mandatory restitution orders made in the sex trafficking sector than in the forced labor sector?
Well, we don't know for sure. Right. So I'll preface I'll make my disclaimer. Kyleigh says we make our disclaimers. But from my experience, just sort of prosecuting these cases and then looking at the cases across the board and looking at sort of the sentencing documentation, the underlying justification for restitution worksheets and requests, even though restitution is mandatory, whether it's forced labor or sex trafficking, you're right. We do see a higher percentage of restitution being ordered in those forced labor cases. And one of the theories is that forced labor is just that. It's obtaining labor or services from someone, oftentimes in an already regulated industry. And so that the labor that they're providing sort of has, an equivalent hourly rate or value of that work that kind of goes along with it. This person should have been making minimum wage, or this person should have been paid overtime when they worked over 40 hours a week. So the calculation becomes a bit more objective in those cases. When you look at sex trafficking cases, there's really good case law that not only is it still mandatory, but there's absolutely a way to calculate restitution in these cases. Nevertheless, it is less clear. What is the value? Should you be paying the victim or the survivor what the pimp or trafficker was making, what the profit was? What is a correct amount of restitution? How do you calculate that? How could you go back and know without sort of, what was the type of work and how long was it going on? So it's a little bit more of a complicated calculation. I think that's part of the reason. And it's not your traditional labor or services. I think that's another part of the reason. But absolutely under the statute, there's no reason not to be creating those calculations. The Department of Labor's Fair Wage and Hour group, they do a fantastic job of working with prosecutors and helping calculate those losses and provide them to the courts. And so we really encourage prosecutors to be putting together robust restitution worksheets and guidelines and requests for judges, not only to present and preserve that on the record, but also to educate the judiciary on these cases, because there really haven't been, in the scheme of all types of federal cases, human trafficking cases are still somewhat, we have judges that are hearing them for the first time. And so judges need to know that they're mandatory, and judges also need to have help in calculating. And so prosecutors need to be prepared for that, talking to wage and hour experts, talking to other experts that can come in and testify about the value of that work, so that victims do get that restitution order, which is so important to their restoration following that exploitation.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I wish we had time to go through all of the questions, but we unfortunately are running short on time. So I'm just going to leave us with one last question. It's a good one to end on. When will the report be released, and where can we find it?
It'll be coming out next Tuesday, June 8th. If you signed up to attend this webinar, you'll actually receive a link to download the report in your inbox. But we'll also be publishing it on the Human Trafficking Institute's website. So feel free to find it there, to share the link there. We'll be blasting it on our social medias, and we would be so grateful if you'd be willing to share the report link with your audiences as well.
Thanks, Kyleigh. And thank you both, Kyleigh and Alyssa, for joining us for this Q&A portion. I'm going to hand this back over to Lindsey to conclude our time together. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Shannon. Thanks, everybody so much. Kyleigh and Alyssa, that was tremendous. So much information packed into a short period of time, but so informative. I want to thank everyone for your questions. There were so many good questions. We're trying to answer them as we're going. But if you still have questions about the report, obviously download the report, take a look. If you still have questions after that, reach out to us. As Shannon said, reach out to us at that contact email address, or just check us out on the website. We're all there. Our emails are there. Reach out to me. I'm happy to field those questions as well. We want to be a resource to you in the community. I want to take just a minute or two and share with you a little bit more broadly about HTI's work, in addition to the Federal Human Trafficking Report, which, as you can see, is a huge lift for our staff, but hopefully also a really great give to the community. So the Human Trafficking Institute was founded sort of by experts in the field, prior prosecutors, prior law enforcement from federal agencies, who many of us had sort of built responses to anti-trafficking movement. We had been prosecutors. I'd been a prosecutor in North Carolina, where there really weren't any prosecutions yet, and along that same line, the Department of Justice founded the Human Trafficking Prosecution Unit back in 2006, 2007. But before that, there was no real specialized unit focusing on cases involving adult victims. And so we've been, over the years, starting to see not only more specialized investigation and prosecution of these cases, which is so important because the coercive element of trafficking cases, the transient nature of victims, just the length of time that exploitation can go on, the hidden nature of the crime makes it really difficult to identify, investigate, and prosecute. And so we need specialized folks doing this. And in the US, over time, we saw that this really works. We see a larger impact. We see more cases identified and investigated proactively and reactively when specialized investigators, prosecutors, multidisciplinary teams, including victim service providers, social workers, are all working collaboratively together to identify victims and to move these cases into the criminal justice system. And so the Human Trafficking Institute looked at some really fantastic data in the US with regard to these enhanced collaborative models of task forces, and said, could we do this outside the US? Could we help encourage similar outcomes in countries that are also working to build their response to their own trafficking in their own countries, which everywhere in the United States, everywhere in the globe has human trafficking, that no one is exempt from this. And so we started doing that. And the Institute started, we have 2 partner countries we work closely with, Uganda and Belize, very different countries. We've got a population of 400,000 in Belize and 40 million in Uganda. But the model is the same. The idea is that we work within the criminal justice system. We work with the cooperation of dedicated criminal justice practitioners within the government system to enhance their response to trafficking in their country, in their communities. And so we do that within the prosecution's office, where we have experts who have been prosecutors for many, many years in human trafficking, training, who actually go and live in the country and work within the government, provide training, consultation, help build resources for prosecutors, work alongside them for a number of years, encouraging that response. And we're seeing really fantastic outcomes, both in Uganda and then in Belize as well. And so this has been just a tremendous opportunity for us to see, could this model continue to sustain success? Could it create sustainable success in this space? And so, we're building out those models. We're including victim assistance coordinators, because we recognize how important that is with regard to victim-centered prosecution, not just in the US, but everywhere around the world. And so our model continues to evolve with the need. And one of the things I'm the most proud about with the Institute, and this is sort of a full circle moment with both the report and our work in Uganda and Belize and around the world, is we really stand to recognize, where could we help? Where could we do better? Where could we take our subject matter expertise? Where could we look at what's happening, and where could we stand in the gap? And in doing that, identify more victims, identify ways to move this ball forward, identify opportunities to push justice up a very steep hill. And so we're really excited about this work, both in the US and abroad. If you want to get more involved, please check our website out. You can become a justice partner that supports our work. We're really excited, and those are monthly supporters of the work that we have at the Institute. Follow us on social media. You'll see lots more information about the report coming out, lots more infographics about the data that's contained in the report, as well as our work abroad. And so please, check out our website, check out these resources, follow us on social media, and then reach out to us. We're real people doing this work. We exist to provide information to practitioners and the public alike, and to help you in the spheres of influence where you're operating, make a change, make a difference. And so thank you for helping us do that by being with us today. Thank you for your wonderful questions and your attention, and taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. Thank you so much to Kyleigh and Alyssa for all of their labor on this report. It really is a tremendous work. And so to all of you for being here today, we say thank you. Please continue to be in touch, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon.